A grease-stained mechanic, a property developer worth $500 million, and one unsigned document that could level an entire neighborhood. When Owen Riley walked into Hartwell Development's glass tower, with his daughter's hand in his and an old folder tucked under his arm, he had maybe 3 minutes before security decided he didn't belong there. What the boardroom didn't know was that the man they were about to throw out held the one signature that could make their entire project illegal. Owen had rehearsed what he'd say on the drive over. He'd gone through it twice at the red light on Maple Street again, while he found parking 2 blocks away because he couldn't afford the tower's underground lot. He'd even said it quietly to Sophie in the passenger seat, just to hear how it sounded out loud. She was 9, and she'd nodded seriously and told him it sounded good, Dad, and that was the most encouragement he'd had in 3 days. The lobby of Hartwell Development smelled like money the way certain places do. Not perfume exactly, but something engineered, neutral, and expensive, the kind of air that made you aware of your own clothes. Owen was wearing his cleanest work shirt, dark blue, no visible oil stains if you didn't look close. He'd washed his hands 3 times that morning and still felt like he'd missed something. Sophie's sneakers squeaked on the polished floor. "It's really tall," she said, looking up at the atrium ceiling 5 stories above them. "Yeah," he squeezed her hand. "Real tall." The reception desk was a long sweep of pale stone with 2 people behind it, a young man with a headset and a woman in her 40s who'd already clocked Owen and Sophie the moment they came through the revolving doors. Her smile arrived before her words did, and it was the kind of smile that didn't require any warmth to function. "Can I help you?" "I need to speak with Nora Vance." Owen kept his voice level. He'd promised himself he'd stay calm. "It's about the Linden Creek development, the Phase 2 approval." Something moved across the woman's face. Not much, a slight tightening. "Mrs. Vance is in meetings all morning. Do you have an appointment?" "No, but what I have is more important than an appointment." The receptionist, her nameplate said Christine, glanced at Sophie, then back at Owen. Her fingers moved toward the keyboard. "Sir, Ms. Vance's schedule is completely full. If you'd like to leave your contact information, I've left contact information. Twice. No one called back." Owen set the folder on the edge of the desk. "I need 5 minutes. That's all. 5 minutes before she signs anything today." Christine picked up her phone without breaking eye contact with him. She pressed a button, spoke quietly. Owen caught the word security. He'd expected that. What he hadn't expected was how much it would feel like being told he didn't exist. 2 men appeared from a side corridor. They were polite about it, which somehow made it worse. The cheerful efficiency of people who did this all the time, who'd learned that politeness was faster than confrontation. One of them had the build of someone who'd played football in university and never quite stopped thinking of himself that way. "Sir, if you'd come with us. I'm not causing any trouble." "We know that. But Ms. Vance isn't available, and we'll need you too." The Linden Creek Purchase Agreement from 2003. Owen didn't move. "There's a community covenant attached to it. Article 9. It requires written consent from the original easement holder before any land in that corridor can be rezoned for commercial development. They're about to rezone." The football player paused. "Sir, I'm the easement holder." Owen looked at him steadily. "My father signed that covenant. When he died last spring, it transferred to me. I've been trying to tell someone at this company for 6 weeks. Nobody answered. So here I am." Sophie pressed closer to his leg. She wasn't scared exactly. She'd learned, since her mother died, to read situations very carefully, and she was reading this one. Her hand found his and held on. The second security guard's radio crackled. He turned slightly, and then the elevator opened. The woman who stepped out was not what Owen had expected from Nora Vance's reputation. He'd imagined someone older, harder, more obviously the kind of person who built luxury condominiums on land that used to be wetland. Nora Vance was maybe 42, sharp-featured, wearing a charcoal suit that fit the way expensive things fit, as if it had been made specifically for her body. Her dark hair was pulled back. She smiled at her desk. She was talking to the man beside her, something about site access and the weekend inspection window, and she moved through the lobby like it was part of her building, which it was. She noticed Owen and Sophie the way you notice something that doesn't fit a pattern. Her eyes swept over them, the work shirt, the folder, the child, and she stopped walking. "What's happening here? We were just asking this gentleman to..." "Owen Riley." He spoke before the security guard could finish. "I'm here about Linden Creek." Nora Vance looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Sophie. How old is your daughter? The question surprised him. 9. And you brought her here. I didn't have anyone to watch her. Her school has a PD day. Something shifted in Nora's expression. He couldn't tell what it was. She looked at the folder under his arm. What's in there? A 2003 purchase agreement, a community covenant, and a registered land survey that shows your Phase 2 footprint overlaps by 42 meters into the easement corridor. The man beside her, 50s, silver-haired, the kind of lawyer face you got from 20 years of poker playing in boardrooms, made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Miss Vance, this is obviously 42 meters. Nora said it quietly, like she was testing the number for weight. The covenant requires written consent from the easement holder before any rezoning application can proceed. Your rezoning was approved last Tuesday. I didn't consent. I didn't even know about it until my father's estate lawyer finally reached me 3 weeks ago. Owen kept his voice measured. He'd promised himself that too. No anger, just facts. I've been trying to reach your office since then. 6 emails, 2 phone calls. I drove here from Millhaven yesterday. Millhaven. The lawyer's tone made it a dismissal. Mrs. Vance, we have a signing in 11 minutes. Whatever this gentleman believes he has. I know what I have. Owen opened the folder, held it out. Article 9, subsection 3. It's not ambiguous. Nora Vance didn't take it. She looked at him instead. You're a mechanic. I own a garage. I was a mechanical engineer for 12 years before that. Powertrain systems, mostly. I know how to read a technical document. This is a legal document. I had it reviewed by a real estate lawyer in Kingston. She confirmed the covenant is valid and registered. The consent clause is enforceable. He paused. I'm not here to cause problems, Ms. Vance. I drove 3 hours to tell you this in person because nobody would take my calls. Something's wrong with this rezoning, and if you sign those papers today, you're going to be in a much more difficult position than you are right now. Nora Vance was quiet for a moment. Behind her, the lobby hummed with its expensive quiet, and Sophie stood perfectly still beside Owen, the way she'd learned to stand when things were important. Then Nora said, Call the police, Richard. Owen blinked. I'm sorry. This man is trespassing, and he's interfering with a scheduled legal proceeding. Her voice had gone flat and professional. I want him removed and charged. Ms. Vance. Now. The football player's security guard reached for Owen's arm. Owen didn't resist. There was no point, and Sophie was watching. Hey, he said quietly to his daughter. It's okay. Sophie's jaw was set tight. She was 9 years old, and she was doing that thing she'd started doing after Carol died, that thing where she held her feelings in with everything she had until they found somewhere better to go. I don't want them to take you, she said. They're not going to take me anywhere for long. He crouched down to her. Remember Mrs. Ouellette, next door? She said she'd come if I called. I remember. You okay? She nodded. She wasn't entirely, but she was trying. 2 RCMP officers came in through the front door 7 minutes later. They were professional about it. Owen didn't fight them. He'd been cited before. A noise complaint from a neighbor who didn't like the sound of engines, back when Sophie was a toddler. And he knew that the fastest way through this was to go quietly and let things unsnarl themselves. He did look back once, through the glass of the revolving door. Nora Vance was standing in the middle of her lobby, the folder Owen had left behind in her hands, turning it over without opening it. Her expression was impossible to read from 30 feet away through glass. She handed it to the silver-haired lawyer. He saw the lawyer tuck it under his arm without looking at it. The police cruiser smelled like synthetic pine and stale coffee. The officer in the passenger seat was young, maybe 26, with an honest face that looked uncomfortable about the whole situation. His partner was older, said nothing, drove. Owen sat in the back and thought about the covenant. He'd found it by accident, really. After his father Ted passed in April, Owen had driven back to Millhaven to sort through the house. Ted hadn't been an organized man. Boxes of receipts dating back to 1987, filing cabinets full of utility bills, a ceramic rooster on the kitchen counter that Owen had always found depressing. But in the drawer of the old roll-top desk in the back room, he'd found a file folder rubber-banded shut, labeled in Ted's handwriting, Linden Creek, important. Ted Riley had never been important in any official sense. He'd worked in the mill for 30 years, then at a hardware store after the mill closed. Then he'd retired and tended his tomatoes and minded his business. But in 2003, when a property developer had approached the town about purchasing the old agricultural land along Linden Creek. Ted had been on the landowners committee. He'd helped negotiate the community covenant, the agreement that kept the creek corridor protected, that kept the wetland buffer intact, that maintained the natural drainage for a dozen properties downstream, including the Kowalski farm, the community garden, and the little park where Sophie had played when she was small. Ted had signed the covenant as the registered easement holder, and he'd never told Owen. Maybe he'd meant to. Maybe he'd figured it would come up when it needed to. Or maybe he'd just been Ted, private, self-contained, a man who kept his important things in labeled folders and assumed the world would sort itself out. Owen had spent 6 weeks trying to sort it out before giving up on phone calls and emails and driving to Toronto. The holding area at the division station was beige and smelled like the floor cleaner. Owen sat on a bench and stared at the cinder block wall opposite and thought about Sophie staying with Mrs. Ouellette and about the signing that was probably happening right now in a glass tower 40 minutes away, and about the way Nora Vance had looked at the folder before handing it off without opening it. He was still thinking about that when the door opened. The woman who walked in was not an RCMP officer. She was somewhere in her early 60s, white hair cut very short, carrying a briefcase that looked like it had seen the inside of a lot of courtrooms. She wore a dark green blazer and reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and she sat down across from Owen with the efficiency of someone who did not waste time on preamble. Mr. Riley. Yeah, Constance Birch. I'm a solicitor with Glenmore Birch, which is a land use and property rights practice out of Ottawa. I've been retained by the Millhaven Community Land Trust, of which your father was a founding member. She opened her briefcase. We've been monitoring the Linden Creek rezoning since the application was filed. We knew the covenant existed. We didn't know where the registered holder was until the estate lawyer filed probate last month. Owen looked at her. You've been watching this. We've been building a file. We had the covenant. We had the survey. We had a preliminary analysis of the rezoning application. What we didn't have was you. Constance Birch put a folder on the table. The consent requirement in Article 9 is ironclad, Mr. Riley. The rezoning approval that the town issued last Tuesday is procedurally void. Hartwell Development either didn't know about the covenant, which is possible, given how it was registered, or they knew and were gambling that no one would surface to enforce it before the project financing closed. Owen was quiet for a moment. The signing today is the closing of a $340 million project financing package with 3 institutional lenders. Once that closes, construction contracts get signed, equipment gets mobilized, and the whole thing becomes infinitely harder to unwind. Constance looked at him steadily. Which is why we need to move today. What does that mean? It means I file an emergency injunction in the next 45 minutes, and a judge I've already briefed issues an interim order halting the closing pending a hearing on the covenant's validity. She paused. I can do this with or without your active participation, but it's cleaner and faster with you. You're the holder of record. Owen thought about Sophie at Mrs. Ouellette's, about the creek behind his father's house, the one he'd caught crayfish in when he was 10, about the Phase 2 footprint on the survey map, the one that had shown him, in simple blue lines, exactly where Hartwell's towers were planned to stand. The Kowalski farm, he said. They're downstream. If the wetland buffer gets removed, their drainage situation becomes very difficult. Yes, we know. And the community garden, paved over in Phase 2, along with the park. Owen nodded slowly. He'd grown up 2 streets from that park. Sophie had grown up running through it. The summers Carol was still alive, and they'd drive up to see Ted on weekends. What do you need from me? He said. They released him 40 minutes later. The charges dropped on grounds that the RCMP had been advised by the Crown that arresting an individual for exercising their rights as a registered easement holder created significant civil liability exposure for everyone involved. The duty sergeant read this information from a sheet of paper with the expression of a man who'd had a more straightforward morning in mind. Constance was waiting outside with a car, a sensible dark sedan, and a driver who said nothing and navigated Toronto traffic like he'd been doing it since before most of the cars on the road were manufactured. We have 90 minutes, Constance said, reviewing documents on a tablet. The closing was scheduled for 2 o'clock. The injunction has been filed. The judge is reviewing it now. We should hear back within the hour. Owen looked out the window at the city moving past. Nora Vance had the folder, he said. She didn't open it. I know. My contact inside the building told me. He looked at her. You have a contact inside Hartwell? I have contacts in a lot of places. Constance didn't look up from her tablet. One of her project managers has been uncomfortable with this file for several months. His name isn't important. What matters is that someone on the inside knew the covenant existed. Owen turned back to the window. Was she told, Vance? Constance was quiet for a moment. Then she said, That's an interesting question. The short answer is, we're not sure. The longer answer is that Richard Hallett, the lawyer you saw this morning, the silver-haired one, has been the external counsel on this project from the beginning. He's the one who would have seen the covenant in the original due diligence. And Richard Hallett's firm also did work for the 3 lenders financing the project. He's on both sides of this transaction. Constance finally looked up. That's not automatically illegal, but it creates interesting questions about what he disclosed to whom. Owen felt something settle in his chest. Not anger, something quieter and more determined. You think he knew about Article 9? I think it would be very difficult for a land use lawyer who reviewed the 2003 purchase documents to miss a registered covenant in the title search. Constance's voice was matter-of-fact, but that's a question for a future proceeding. Right now, we focus on the injunction. The car pulled up to Hartwell's building. This time when Owen came through the revolving doors, there was already someone waiting. A young woman in a charcoal blazer who introduced herself as Ms. Vance's executive assistant and who led them to the elevator without any of the lobby theater from that morning. The lobby staff watched them pass. Christine at the reception desk watched Owen with an expression he couldn't decode. The 34th floor was different from the lobby. Quieter, the carpet thicker, the walls hung with architectural renderings of buildings that hadn't been built yet. The Linden Creek development had its own rendering, floor to ceiling, showing glass towers rising from a reclaimed landscape with tasteful trees and a decorative pond. The creek wasn't in it. The boardroom was at the end of the corridor. Through the glass wall, Owen could see Nora Vance standing at the head of a long table. 3 men he didn't recognize. The lender's representatives, presumably. Richard Hallett off to one side, his silver hair catching the afternoon light. Documents spread across the table. The energy of a room that was about to do something it had been working toward for a long time. The assistant opened the door. Nora Vance looked up. When she saw Owen, something moved across her face. Irritation first, then something more complicated when she saw Constance Birch behind him. Constance. Her voice was flat. Nora. Constance set her briefcase down on the nearest chair. You're aware that the interim injunction was issued 12 minutes ago. One of the lender's men sat up straighter. What injunction? The Phase 2 closing is subject to an interim court order pending a hearing on the validity of the rezoning approval. The rezoning application failed to account for a registered community covenant requiring easement holder consent. Constance opened her briefcase and distributed copies of documents around the table with the calm efficiency of someone who'd done this many times. The covenant is valid. The consent was never sought. The rezoning approval is procedurally void. Richard Hallett stood up. This is a bad faith interference with a legitimate... Mr. Hallett. Constance looked at him over her reading glasses. You conducted the title search on the 2003 purchase documents. The covenant appears on page 11 of that agreement in Article 9, as we both know. I'd be very careful in the next few minutes about characterizing this as bad faith. The room went quiet. Owen watched Hallett's face. He'd learned to read faces across the hood of a car, across a service counter, across the kind of conversations where someone was trying to tell you the engine was fine when you could hear that it wasn't. Hallett's face right now was the face of a man recalculating. One of the lender's men cleared his throat. Ms. Birch, if there's a court order, there is. I have a copy for each of you. Constance was already distributing them. Then we can't proceed today. The man looked at Nora Vance with the expression of someone who had other appointments. We'll need to review the title position before we can close. Nora Vance hadn't moved. She was looking at Owen. You drove from Millhaven, she said. Yesterday, and before that, 6 weeks of trying to reach my office. More or less. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, to the room but still looking at Owen, Can everyone give us a few minutes? The lender's men gathered their things with careful speed. Hallett lingered. Nora, I really think. I'll call you, Richard. He left. The others filed out. Constance looked at Owen, and he gave her a small nod, and she moved to the far end of the room to give them space. Nora Vance sat down. For the first time that day, she looked like a person rather than a position. Sit down, she said. Owen sat. That folder you left this morning. She folded her hands on the table. Richard told me it was a shakedown. A property rights troll who'd found something technical in the chain of title and wanted to extract a payout before we could close. That's not what I wanted. I know that now. She looked at her hands. I've been building projects for 18 years. You develop a certain immunity to people who show up with paperwork and grievances. You have to. There are always people with paperwork and grievances. Usually Richard handles it. She paused. I should have looked at the folder. Owen didn't say anything. The covenant. She finally looked up. What do you actually want? He thought about how to answer that. About what his father had wanted, signing his name to that document in 2003. What Ted had understood with his millworker's practicality about what it meant when land got sold and what protections you put in place to make sure the sale didn't become something else. The creek corridor stays intact, Owen said. The wetland buffer doesn't get developed. The park doesn't get paved. He leaned forward slightly. Your towers can still get built. Phase 2 is a significant project. I know that. I've looked at the footprint. You can redesign the southeast corner to stay outside the easement boundary. You lose maybe 4 units per floor on 2 of the towers. The project still works. It's just smaller. Nora Vance studied him. You've looked at the footprint. I was an engineer for 12 years. I know how to read a site plan. The Kowalski farm. You mentioned them this morning. They're downstream. 3 generations on that land. They depend on that drainage corridor. She was quiet. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city spread out in every direction, the kind of view that made everything below look small and manageable, like a problem you could solve if you just repositioned a few things. Richard knew, she said. It wasn't a question. Owen didn't answer. He knew about the covenant, and he didn't tell me. She said it quietly, like something she was working out in real time, because disclosing it would have required us to either get consent, which meant finding your father, which meant finding out he'd died and the covenant had transferred, or redesign phase 2. And Richard had already committed the timeline to the lenders. She pressed her fingers together. And he figured the covenant holder would never surface. My dad wasn't exactly easy to find, Owen said. Ted Riley, retired millworker, Millhaven, Ontario. Not a lot of digital footprint. No. Nora almost smiled. It was a tired smile. I suppose not. Owen looked at the architectural rendering on the wall. The tasteful trees. The decorative pond where the creek used to be. He used to take me fishing in that creek, he said. When I was a kid. It's not a big creek. You can step across it in most places. But it runs cold all summer because of the groundwater, and the crayfish were always there, under the rocks. He paused. My daughter played in that park. Her mother used to bring her. The summers we'd go up to see my dad. Nora Vance looked at him for a long moment. I'm sorry about your wife, she said. Owen nodded. I'm sorry about your father, too. He nodded again. His throat was doing something inconvenient, and he waited for it to stop. The consent process, Constance said from the far end of the room. Owen had almost forgotten she was there. If Ms. Vance wants to pursue consent under Article 9, it's a negotiated agreement. Mr. Riley sets the conditions. You document them. The rezoning gets amended to reflect the agreed boundary. It adds time to your closing, probably 60 to 90 days, but it's a defensible path forward. Nora looked from Constance to Owen and back. And if I'd rather fight the injunction? Then you spend the next 6 to 18 months in litigation, during which time your project financing sits in escrow and your lenders get nervous and start asking questions about what else might be wrong with the title. Constance's voice was pleasant, and Richard Hallett becomes the subject of a Law Society complaint regarding his failure to disclose a known encumbrance. The silence in the room was the kind that meant someone was making a decision. The southeast corner redesign, Nora said finally, looking at Owen. You said you'd looked at the footprint. I have a rough sketch. Nothing formal. Would you be willing to sit down with my project team and work through it? Owen looked at her carefully. Why would you want that? Because you're an engineer who's actually looked at the site plan, and most of the people I pay to do, that have been telling me what I want to hear for 8 months. Nora Vance's voice was dry. Also, because you drove 3 hours to tell me something I should have listened to the first time, and that counts for something. Owen was quiet for a moment. The park stays, he said. Non-negotiable. The creek corridor buffer gets written into the consent agreement with a maintenance obligation. The Kowalski Farm drainage issue gets addressed in the revised site plan. Agreed. And Richard Hallett doesn't work on this project anymore. Nora looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. They worked out the framework. In the next 2 hours, Constance taking notes, Nora's assistant bringing coffee that Owen didn't drink. By the time they shook hands in the elevator lobby, the lenders had been notified of the delay, and Richard Hallett had been called and told in Nora's flat professional voice that his retainer on the project was terminated effective immediately. Owen called Mrs. Ouellette from the car on the way to pick up Sophie. All done? Mrs. Ouellette said. More or less. Sophie made butter tarts. She insisted on measuring everything herself. He was quiet for a second. How are they? Honestly, a little salty. But she's very proud of them. Tell her I'll eat everyone. Sophie was waiting on Mrs. Ouellette's front step when the car pulled up. She came down the walkway fast, not quite running, maintaining the dignity of someone who had been waiting very patiently and intended to be acknowledged for it. Did it work? She said. Yeah, it worked. Did you have to go to jail? For a little while. Holding cell, not jail. She considered this distinction. Mrs. Ouellette says those are basically the same thing. Mrs. Ouellette is not a lawyer. Sophie looked at the woman in the dark green blazer who'd gotten out of the car with Owen. Are you a lawyer? She asked. Constance Birch looked at the 9-year-old with the salty butter tarts and the serious eyes and said, I am. Is my dad in trouble? Your dad is not in trouble. Sophie looked back at Owen. Good, she said, in a tone that meant she'd been fairly sure of this all along, but was glad to have it confirmed. Then she held out a paper plate covered in plastic wrap. I made butter tarts. They might be a little salty. Owen took one. It was, in fact, quite salty. It was the best thing he'd eaten in 3 days. The following weeks moved the way things moved after a crisis, slowly at first, then all at once. The injunction hearing was scheduled, then adjourned, then settled by consent, when Nora Vance's legal team filed a revised rezoning application that reflected the agreed easement boundary. The lenders reviewed the amended title position, and after 61 days, the closing happened in a conference room Owen wasn't in. Constance sent him a text. Done. Project financing closed. Covenant registered as amended. Congratulations. He read it in the garage under a 2009 F-150 with a transmission that had been giving its owner grief for 2 weeks. Richard Hallett's situation took longer to resolve, and Owen mostly tried not to follow it. Constance had filed the Law Society complaint. The investigation was ongoing. Owen didn't have the energy for anything that took that long to unfold. What he did do on a Saturday in late September was drive up to Millhaven with Sophie. They walked down to Linden Creek, the way Ted used to take Owen when he was small. Through the gate at the back of the property, down the slope through the goldenrod, to the flat rocks at the edge of the water where the creek ran cold even at the end of summer. Sophie took her shoes off and stood in the shallows. It's freezing, she said. Yeah, Grandpa Ted used to bring you here? Every summer. Owen crouched at the edge of the bank the way he had as a kid, looking for movement under the rocks. We'd catch crayfish and then put them back. He said the point wasn't to keep them. The point was to see how many you could find. Sophie reached into the water with both hands and immediately came up empty. They're fast, she said. Very fast. She tried again and again. On the 4th try, she got one, small, dark, clicking its claws in mild outrage at being lifted out of its element. She looked at it seriously. We put it back, Owen said. I know. But she held it for another moment, studying it. Then she lowered her hands to the water, and it was gone in an instant, back under its rock. Dad. She dried her hands on her jeans and looked up at him. Yeah. The people who were going to build the towers, they would have put a fake pond here instead. That was the plan. She thought about this. Why do people do that? Make fake versions of things instead of just keeping the real thing. Owen sat down on the flat rock the way his father used to sit and looked at the water. Sometimes they don't see what's already there, he said. They see what they could put in its place, what they could build, what they could charge for. He paused. And sometimes someone has to stop and say, no, look at what's actually here. Sophie sat down beside him, her wet feet on the warm stone. Like you did. Like your grandfather did, a long time ago, when he signed a piece of paper that said this place mattered. Owen picked up a flat stone and turned it over in his hands, the way Ted used to do. I just showed up to remind people it was there. They stayed until the afternoon light went low and golden across the water, the way it did at the end of summer when the season finally admitted it was leaving. On the way back up the slope, Sophie stopped and looked at the Kowalski farm across the fence line, its fields still gold with the last of the season. "They're okay?" she asked. "The farm people. They're okay." She nodded. Then she reached up and took Owen's hand, the way she'd done when she was smaller, and they walked back up to Ted's house through the goldenrod. Inside, it still smelled like him. That particular mix of wood and old paper and the coffee he'd made too strong every morning of his adult life. Owen had been meaning to sort through the rest of the boxes for months and hadn't managed it yet. He made tea instead. Sophie found a puzzle in the hall closet and spread it on the kitchen table. And they sat together in Ted Riley's kitchen while the sun went down outside, and the radiator ticked its familiar tick, and Sophie put the edge pieces together with the focused seriousness she brought to everything. And Owen watched her and thought about his father, signing a covenant nobody else thought was important, in a room nobody remembered, on behalf of a creek that barely made the maps. The things people did quietly, the things they left behind. His phone buzzed. A message from Nora Vance. They'd exchanged numbers at some point in the process, and she'd taken to sending occasional brief messages, nothing that required a response, just small dispatches. Southeast corner redesign approved by planning. 4 units less per floor on towers B and C. We're calling it the creek setback in the site documents. Your father's name is on the easement. Thought you'd want to know. Owen set the phone face down on the table. Sophie looked up. Good news or complicated news? Both, he said. Mostly good. She went back to her puzzle. The kitchen was warm and small, and full of things Ted touched every day for 40 years. And outside in the dark, the creek was running the way it had always run, cold and quick over its rocks, going wherever it was going. Owen finished his tea and helped his daughter find the corner pieces, and that was enough.